for that song, Jonathan. In Mark 9, verses go through the gospel in a short way, and I'm going to be talking about, do you not still see? Can you not see and understand? And I want to talk about the slowness of spiritual perception in Mark's gospel today. In Mark 9:31, Jesus said to his disciples, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. I might go one step further and say they didn't understand here because they were afraid, and because they were afraid, they studiously avoided asking about it. Now, we might find it strange for disciples to be following Jesus and to studiously avoid the subject of death and resurrection. But that's what Mark's gospel describes here. You would think maybe that people, for instance, that had a terminal diagnosis of cancer and were in the hospital for a month, and then in the last days, maybe hours, they eventually get around to talking about death and making preparation for death. You'd think that they would talk about it when that prospect was on the horizon, but I can tell you from experience that doesn't always happen. We tend to avoid subjects that scare us, even when they're right in front of us, don't we? The disciples might have been afraid to simply ask Jesus because they were afraid of looking dumb. They were afraid of disappointing Jesus. I suspect that they got tired of being, what should we say, class dunces over and over again. I bet they got more tired of that than Jesus got tired of them not catching on. And so they might not have raised their hand to ask the teacher because they were thinking maybe we ought to already have known this. Fear of loss, fear of looking dumb might keep us from the big important questions, might lead to a kind of avoidance in our life, but many of us just habitually avoid the big questions, the big matters spiritually, I think because we live in a kind of protective bubble. Now, are you with me here? Especially those of us who are quite comfortable in this country, I think, live in kinds of protective bubbles that shield us from our moral responsibility. In October 1862, a writer for the New York Times had just been to a museum where Matthew Brady's company, but it was Alexander Gardner who did the photographs, had taken pictures of mostly Confederate dead on the battlefield of Antietam. And this is what the writer for the New York Times wrote. The dead of the battlefield come up to us very rarely, even in our dreams. Yes, we see the list in the morning paper at breakfast, but we dismiss the recollection over coffee. There's a confused mass of names, but they're all strangers. We forget the horrible significance that dwells amid the jumble of type. Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he's done something very near to it. Yet there is one phase that has escaped his photographic skill. It's the background of widows, orphans, torn from the bosom of their natural protectors by red, remorseless battle. Homes have been made desolate, and the light of life in thousands of hearts has been quenched forever. And all of this desolation, imagination must paint. For broken hearts cannot be photographed. In other words, New Yorkers were dying in droves and had been for months. The daily obituaries were full of names, but that didn't necessarily awaken New Yorkers to what was really happening. It didn't necessarily awaken New Yorkers to the moral imperative to be either peacemakers or even to respond to the pressing need to care for the widow and the orphan. It didn't lead them to care for the oppressed. In other words, it took an intrusive kind of word, almost an invasion of their cherished safe space, where someone comes and, metaphorically, litters their lawns with rotting corpses so that our moral imaginations can be awakened. Awakened to truths about the need for us to share burdens in society, to share burdens and to know what's going on, truths about our responsibility and ourselves that we might rather not face. Avoidance can be a kind of forgetfulness, not just living in a bubble, but it's a kind of forgetfulness that's accomplished with the taste of coffee and reassuring morning routines. Now, are you with me? After breakfast, we'll need to shave. And you don't want to mess around thinking about life-altering ideas, worldviews while you're shaving, because you'll cut yourself. You'd better not have your head in the clouds when you're trying to shepherd little children across the street. Yes? You can't do a good job at work if you're thinking yourself out of your box and not paying attention to what you're supposed to be doing. Your hand needs to be on the plow and your mind needs to be on your business. Yeah? Otherwise, you'll lose your job. Everyday business then can just kind of overwhelm our consideration of the big questions and about our existence. We can hide from true spiritual perception with just being too busy. But our avoidance can also be assisted by a kind of distracting frivolity. Now, are you with me here? I teach high school once a week. there's such a thing as distracting frivolity that suggests that life is really all about laughs. You know, back in the 90s, shows like Seinfeld introduced the idea that shows could really, truly be about absolutely nada. Yeah. Such entertainment can be part of what Don DeLillo back in the 80s called white noise. I need to start reading a little more in contemporary stuff. All my illustrations are from the 80s and 90s. I'm getting to be an old fogey, and I need to face that reality. Yeah. I got to thinking about this because I started to say, what's white noise? It's that static in the background, but that metaphor belongs to the analog age. You know, when you turned on the TV and there was static when the channel wasn't coming in. White noise is what you do when you turn up the radio so that you can just focus on the lyrics of that crazy song rather than deal with anything else. Right? White noise is that which keeps things going so that you don't ever have to face the silence between you and God. Don't get me wrong. I like entertainment. I like humor. It's healthy to laugh at ourselves and have a good time, but farce aimed at others, irreverence, or simple frivolity will usually aid us in our task of distraction and avoidance. We can be experts at this kind of distraction. Life can be one endless squirrel moment. Squirrel, you know that metaphor? What's that movie? Up. The movie Up, the dog constantly is distracted and he goes, squirrel. Squirrel. Yeah. By the way, I heard a rumor about butter, but I decided not to spread it. And thus, we feel cute and punny, if not discreet, self-satisfied like snickering teens in a world where there's nothing too serious to worry about. But in some situations, our distraction requires a kind of numbing propaganda to help us along with avoiding the big questions. In 1863, only a few people in Manhattan got to see Brady's photos of the Confederate dead. But many thousands consumed Currier and Ives prints. Right? Currier and Ives' artwork was cut into lithographs. I mean, guys like Alfred and William Woad, Edwin Forbes, Winslow Homer, they went out and they sketched the battlefield in real time. But what Currier and Ives did is that they produced lithographs of heroic action, glorious heroism. And things like this appeared in Harper's Weekly, which portrayed the whole thing as a glorious, sanitary, and sacrificial affair. Of course, we never recognize our own propaganda for what it is, right? We might notice that nothing ruins a Popeye cartoon or an episode of Wonder Woman like serious moral analysis. Are you with me here? Don't mess with my enjoyment of Rambo First Blood Part 53. I like my myth of redemptive violence without anybody pointing to me that is what it is. My point today is not to suggest that we should be pacifist or militant. Don't think that. I haven't ever resolved that question. I don't think I ever will. My point is to say that the big moral questions in crisis moments are usually avoided by telling reassuring stories that aren't true or not fully true. We comfort ourselves with fantasies. Next slide, please. I love this. I love Calvin and Hobbes. For show and tell, Calvin says, today I don't have anything to show. But I'll tell you that when I'm at school, my mom puts on a patriotic leotard, a cape, and a knee-high, high-heeled boots, and she fights crime as a superheroine. I hope you all are duly impressed. Thank you very much. In such cases, truth doesn't matter as much as the confirmation of what it is that we want to believe, right? Children under the age of 10 want their parental heroics plain and simple, please. If our parents are heroic, if our grandparents are heroic, chances are we're going to be heroic too. They keep us safe, I'm safe, and I'll be the hero of my own story one day. Yeah? Yeah? And the villains, they are other people. Now, I don't want to disabuse Calvin of this childhood vision. But sometimes we grown-ups might want to take a closer look. And so Jesus ministers today. This is all by way of introduction, but don't worry, I'm about ready to close things down. Jesus ministers to disciples, right, who are variously filled with fears about loss, fears of disappointing their teacher with their slowness, for they live in bubbles that they don't want burst. And He'd called them from their pressing concerns about their fishing businesses and routines, but they still could fill the air with distractions and live in other stories that don't make sense of Jesus. And so Jesus begins His parabolic ministry in Mark chapter 4. And as He explains the parable of the sower to His disciples, He asks in verse 13, "Don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable if you can't get this one?" The first parable that Jesus tells then is a key to all the others, and the key to understanding what the word of the kingdom is like is the key of it. It goes like this. You need to understand that the word is a seed. Yeah? Preaching the word and sowing the seed are set side by side and compared. That's what a parable is. And Jesus says, stare at the mysterious work of a seed. Even today, science can't tell you why a seed germinates. We can describe the chemical process. We know the exact chemical composition of a seed. We could even provide the chemicals and create the same chemical stuff. But it's not going to work as a seed, and we don't have any idea why our chemicals won't work, except that they're just not alive, like a seed is alive. Do you catch it? The mystery of life inherent in a seed Get the metaphor. Spiritual understanding in life is something that the seed makes possible by dying and rising from deep within us. Yes? The soul is a kind of soil. The self, the human life, is a kind of soil in which the word seed enters, penetrates, dies, and rises within. The seed of the Word then can fall upon a path, upon a person so hardened against spirituality that it can't germinate. We've always seen that, haven't we? You got to till that garden. The Word, too, can fall on rocky places that are shallow in their reception of the death and rising seed, so that it withers and it quits growing when difficult times come and it gets to be a drought. Right? Other seed falls among the thorns and the cares of the world, so that the weedy interests and concerns about paying the bills, interests and concerns about getting the next paycheck, and all of these worries crowd out interest in the things of life. Spiritual understanding comes by letting the seed die deeply into the heart and rise and making a harvest as much as 100-fold. And Jesus lets us know from the start that you have to cherish this mystery of life, the living words dying and rising deep within you. And so you shouldn't be so captive to perpetual pride and avoidance. You shouldn't be so captive to the desire for comfort that you don't stay around for the process, even when it's costly, right? And we shouldn't be so wrapped up and worried about things and the way we might pay the bills for things that we miss life. That's where this business of understanding, some of them would be ever not understanding, right? And he just begins with his disciples there. And then in Mark 6 and verse 50, there's another interesting passage. Jesus appears to his disciples bestriding the chaotic storms of life, right? And immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it's I." In English, that's fine. But in Greek, it's ego eimi. It's the divine name. Take courage. The great I Am is here. Take courage. It's I. Don't be afraid. And then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down, and they were amazed. And verse 52 says, "For they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened." It was like they were the path in the first part of the parable. They saw Jesus feed the 5,000, but when the storm came, their hearts were still afraid. Yeah? They didn't really get that they were safe if they were following Jesus. They didn't really get that the safest place in the world was right in the center of the heart of God. They still lived life scared to death because their hearts had a hardness to it. There's this persistent habit to worry even when all the resources to bring us to life are present in the Word and the seed of life. We're still conditioned to believe that death is final and that there's no way to be ultimately and finally alive. And that the word of Jesus, the word that Jesus sows in our hearts, is so radically different than everything else that we've ever known, that it just seems crazy to the flesh, crazy to the sinful nature to trust it. And Jesus says, courage. Courage, folks. It's me. Hey, the great I am, you know. Learning requires that we quit listening. Listen, we quit listening to our fears long enough to learn. They had not understood that Jesus is the embodiment of the God of Israel. They had not understood that He claims here to be their Savior. They had not understood that whatever Jesus is, He represents God's presence. Therefore, all things are always all manner of well. And then after feeding the 4,000, this kind of motif appears again. It's not just that the 4,000 looks an awful lot like the feeding of the 4,000 looks like the feeding of the 5,000. What happens after the feeding is very, very similar as well. In Mark 8:15, be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And they discussed this with one another and said, it's because we forgot the bread. Isn't that something? Jesus warns them about the leaven, right, of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And they think He's mad at them because they forgot to bring the bread along with them. Some of us just live with perpetual insecurity and guilt, right? And we do that because we like to believe that somehow we have control over the ultimate destiny of what's going to happen to us, right? If it's our fault, then we can do something about it. You with me? And so we will tend to blame ourselves when it's not our fault, right? And I think this is the kind of thing that the disciples are doing here. And they discussed this with one another. And they said it's because we just haven't brought enough of this bread that Jesus was busy giving us stern warnings, you know. And aware of their discussion, verse 17, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see and understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls or pieces did you pick up? 12. Isn't that interesting? They've got that answer right there. 12. They know, it's a multiple choice exam. Oh, that's easy. They marked in C, 12, correct answer. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And they answered, 7. I mean, 12 and 7, perfect kind of numbers, right? Do you still not get it? Do you still not understand? His disciples here have a hard time with these metaphors, don't they? Yeah. And the Pharisees and the Herodians, they don't have seeds. They got yeast. A yeast that will insidiously grow and defile the Passover sacrifice, yes? And Jesus says, beware of that kind of yeast, the kind of yeast that can see signs and then demand signs. The kind of yeast that thinks that their rules will satisfy the requirements of the kingdom and that they can keep the kingdom requirements in a way that will make the kingdom obligated to them. Beware of that kind of legalism. Beware that kind of yeast that ruins churches and defiles cultures. And Jesus reminds them, no. Have you not got this yet? The kingdom advances because of the self-generating mystery, the self-generating life of God. Huh? That's how you can feed 5,000 with a little bit of nothing, or 4,000 with a little bit of nothing. It doesn't have anything to do with you. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you forgot the bread or not. Huh? I could have done it without any bread at all. Can't you see? It's about my power. And so the disciples throughout Mark, as in the other Gospels, have a hard time really getting their mind and hearts around the kingdom, don't they? But the good news today, Aaron, if you go to that one, the good news today is that you're not going to surprise Jesus with your own slowness of heart. Are you with me here? Isn't that good news? Yes, it may be true that we should be farther along in the spiritual path than we are, or at least we think we should be. Yes, it might be true that Jesus picked some disciples that were slow. But in chapter 1 and verse 16, if you want to turn there, in chapter 1 and verse 16, the text says that he saw, not blepo, he didn't just see Simon and Andrew, he saw them. He perceived them. He discerned them. It's a different verb. And this word eido doesn't just mean, to look at. It means to really recognize something in them. And then a little further along, it says in 1:19, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. And he didn't just blepo look at them. He actually, these guys. He perceived a real faith, a willingness to follow in them. And the creative life-generating mystery wants to root itself deeply within your soul today, for Christ has seen and perceived you as well. He's called you as He called Simon, Peter, and Andrew, James, and John. And I'm convinced He perceives the same kind of willingness to follow in the life of the church today. We need to be reminded that ego eimi, God Himself really wants to dwell in us, and that the creative, self-generating mystery wants to root itself deeply in us, and that the process of dying and rising can be, yes, admittedly scary, but after all, it is God with us, in us, telling us to take courage. And so we choose not to let our fears keep us from learning and growing, and we resolve that the cross, though it may be uncomfortable, is a process worth staying with. Staying with through times of scorching drought. And so we don't let weedy foreign priorities choke out the cultivation of that mystery in our hearts. Rather humbly we accept the word planted in you, James says. Or 1 Peter 1:4, you have gained an inheritance that can never perish, church. You got an inheritance that can never perish, right? It's not sunk in the stock market. It's sunk in the divine treasury, in the heavenly treasury. It's kept in heaven for you who through faith are shielded by God's power. So, do you understand? What can we do as we close in light of this good news? How might we facilitate our learning? From these texts, I would say, number one, calm down. It's going to be all right. Are you with me here on this one? You're probably not going to learn anything while you're scared to death. If you're scared to death, you're going to cling to what's familiar. That's what fear does. So calm down. It's going to be all right. Knock on the door and the door will be opened. It will happen. 2, slow down. Face the otherwise scary stuff. Don't be ashamed of what you don't know. Don't think that your mistakes are going to cause you to lose a spot on God's team. It doesn't work that way. That's not who God is. 3rd, recognize that we sometimes live in a bubble and that our comforts can sometimes blind us to the suffering and the dying and the rising that are happening all around us. 4th, realize that a lot of the things that we've always believed were things that we're telling ourselves to make us the hero in what is God's story. I don't want to be the hero in God's story. I want God to be the hero of His story. Yeah? And that's just how the flesh works. Just understand that about the flesh. But 5, finally, be confident of this. Be confident that He who began a great work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus Christ. Isn't that what Paul told the Philippians? Yeah. It's going to happen. Just stay after it. There you go. Do you not still see and understand? As we stand and sing.